September 17th, 1944. Just after 1300 hours, the sky above Arnhem, Netherlands, fills with a sound that German flak crews have never heard before. Not the roar of bombers, not the scream of fighters, something else, something that sounds like wind whistling through a massive wooden instrument. Then they see them, hundreds upon hundreds of gliders, their fabric-covered plywood frames catching the afternoon sun as they release from their tow planes and begin their silent descent toward Dutch farmland. On the ground, Hauptmann Klaus Becker of the 9th SS Panzer Division watches through binoculars from his command post in Oosterbeek. He turns to his adjutant and laughs. The British are sending furniture to fight us. Those things will splinter like kindling. Within 6 hours, his entire division will be fighting for survival against 13,000 Allied paratroopers who've just landed in the largest airborne operation in history. And those wooden gliders he'd mocked will have delivered artillery pieces, jeeps, anti-tank guns, and enough firepower to threaten Germany's entire position in the Netherlands. This wasn't supposed to be possible. German intelligence had spent 3 years analysing Allied airborne capabilities, and their conclusion was unanimous. Wooden gliders were a desperate improvisation by nations that couldn't afford proper aircraft. They were too fragile for combat operations, too vulnerable to weather, too likely to disintegrate on landing. The Germans had their own glider program, but they'd largely abandoned it after the catastrophic losses during the invasion of Crete in May 1941, where elite Fallschirmjäger paratroopers suffered 40% casualties. The lesson seemed clear. Airborne operations were suicide missions. Lightly armed troops dropped behind enemy lines with no heavy weapons, no vehicles, no way to sustain themselves against armoured counterattacks. The Luftwaffe had concluded that gliders couldn't deliver enough combat power to justify their losses. But the Americans and British hadn't abandoned the concept. They'd doubled down on it. They'd built thousands of gliders from plywood and fabric, materials the Germans considered unsuitable for military aircraft. They'd trained tens of thousands of men to fly these engineless craft into combat, and on this September afternoon in 1944, they were about to prove that German assumptions about airborne warfare were catastrophically wrong. The man who'd made this possible wasn't a general or a decorated pilot. He was a British Army officer named George Chatterton, who in 1941 had been handed an impossible assignment. Take a handful of obsolete gliders, create a regiment capable of strategic airborne assault, and do it with almost no resources, while Britain was fighting for survival. The Army Air Corps dismissed him as a fool chasing a fantasy. The RAF refused to cooperate, viewing gliders as a waste of precious aircraft and pilots for towing operations. Even Winston Churchill had his doubts, calling gliders in early discussions a poor man's air force. But Chatterton understood something the skeptics didn't. If you engineered the destruction correctly, you could land artillery and vehicles behind enemy lines faster than conventional paratrops could even consolidate. You could turn lightly armed airborne divisions into mechanized forces within hours of landing. You could strike targets that armored columns would take days to reach. The gliders weren't a limitation, they were a revolution. And the Germans were about to learn that lesson the hardest way possible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Understanding why German intelligence dismissed Allied gliders requires understanding the technical realities of 1941. When George Chatterton took the command of what would become the Glider Pilot Regiment in February 1941, Britain's glider program consisted of exactly 12 gliders. 12. For an entire military branch tasked with airborne assault operations. These weren't even combat gliders. They were hotspur trainers, small two-seat aircraft designed to teach basic gliding skills. They could carry nothing heavier than the pilot and one passenger. They were constructed from wood and fabric because Britain was rationing every pound of aluminum for Spitfires and Hurricanes to fight the Battle of Britain. The German analysis was perfectly logical. Wooden aircraft were inherently fragile. During World War I, wooden biplanes had been replaced by metal construction specifically because wood couldn't handle combat stresses. It warped in humidity, weakened with age, splintered on impact. The idea of building military aircraft from plywood in 1941 seemed like admitting you'd lost the industrial war before the shooting war even ended. The Luftwaffe's own glider program, which had achieved spectacular success during the invasion of Belgium in May 1940, used the DFS-230. This was a proper glider, capable of carrying 10 fully equipped troops. It had performed brilliantly during the assault on Fort Eben-Emael, where German engineers had landed directly on top of the Belgian fortress in a dawn raid that captured what was supposed to be an impregnable position. But even this success had convinced German planners that gliders were too specialized for general use. The DFS-230 required expert pilots. It needed specific landing zones, and most critically, it couldn't deliver heavy weapons. When Germany invaded Crete in May 1941, the operation became a bloodbath. 22,000 German paratroopers jumped onto an island defended by 42,000 Allied troops. The Germans had air superiority, surprise, and elite troops. What they didn't have were vehicles, artillery, or any way to resupply troops once they landed. The Fallschirmjäger jumped with rifles and light machine guns. Their heavier weapons, mortars, and anti-tank guns came down in separate parachute drops that scattered across the landscape. Many landed in Allied positions and were captured or destroyed before German troops could reach them. For 3 days, German paratroopers fought without effective heavy weapons against entrenched defenders. The casualties were horrific. By the time the island fell, Germany had lost over 6,000 men killed or wounded. Kurt Student, the architect of German airborne forces, watched his elite units torn apart. Hitler was so shaken by the losses that he effectively banned large-scale airborne operations for the rest of the war. The Führer told Student directly that the day of the paratrooper is over. The lesson the Wehrmacht drew from Crete was that airborne operations couldn't work against prepared defences. Paratroopers were too lightly armed, too scattered on landing, too vulnerable to counterattack. Gliders might deliver slightly more concentrated force, but they couldn't change the fundamental equation. You simply couldn't land enough combat power by air to hold against armoured ground forces. This analysis shaped German defensive planning for the next 3 years. When German intelligence assessed Allied invasion capabilities, they focused on ports and beaches. They fortified Calais, Le Havre, Cherbourg. They built the Atlantic Wall to defeat amphibious landings. They positioned panzer divisions to counterattack beachheads. Airborne operations were considered nuisance raids at best, sacrificial diversions at worst. German commanders didn't waste defensive resources preparing for large-scale glider assaults because their own experience said such operations were suicide. Meanwhile, in Britain, George Chatterton was proving that everything the Germans believed about gliders was wrong. But first, he had to overcome the British military's own skepticism, and that meant solving problems that seemed physically impossible. The British Army's specification for a combat glider, issued in December 1940, called for an aircraft that could carry 30 troops, or equivalent cargo, land in fields as short as 400 yards, and be cheap enough to produce in thousands. Oh, and it needed to be designed and built immediately because invasion planning couldn't wait for lengthy development programs. The aircraft industry's response was immediate and unanimous. This was impossible. You couldn't build a wooden aircraft that large. Wood couldn't handle the structural loads. A glider carrying 3 tons of troops and equipment would need massive wing spars that would make the aircraft too heavy to tow. Even if you somehow built it, the landing stresses would tear it apart. One aircraft designer calculated that a 30-troop glider landing at typical approach speeds would generate forces that would shatter any wooden airframe. The Air Ministry agreed. They told the army to lower their expectations. Maybe 15 troops. Maybe reinforced landing gear that would add weight and reduce capacity. Maybe operational restrictions that would limit where and when the gliders could be used. George Chatterton refused to accept these limitations. He wasn't an aircraft engineer. His background was army, a cavalry officer who'd transferred to infantry and then volunteered for glider operations because he believed in the concept. But he understood the tactical problem better than the engineers. 15-troop gliders wouldn't work. You'd need twice as many gliders, twice as many tow planes, twice as many pilots. The operational complexity would make large-scale airborne assaults impossible. He needed 30 troops per glider minimum, ideally more, and he needed them to land in rough terrain because combat wouldn't offer prepared airstrips. He found his solution in an unlikely place: a furniture factory. The Airspeed Company in Portsmouth had never built military aircraft. They'd produced small civilian planes before the war, but their expertise was woodworking. When the military specifications for the combat glider reached them in early 1941, their designers didn't try to build a traditional aircraft from wood. They built a flying crate. The Airspeed Horsa, as it would be designated, violated every principle of elegant aircraft design. It was a high-wing monoplane that looked like someone had strapped wings to a freight car. The fuselage was a rectangular wooden box, 67 feet long, with flat sides and sharp corners. It had none of the streamlined curves of proper aircraft. It looked exactly like what it was, a cargo container with wings attached. But those wings were the key to everything. Airspeed's designers had solved the structural problem by making the wings impossibly large. The wingspan was 88 feet, enormous for an aircraft designed to carry only 3.5 tons. This meant the wing loading, the weight per square foot of wing area, was remarkably low. Low wing loading meant the glider could fly slowly without stalling. Flying slowly meant gentler landing impacts. Gentler impacts meant the wooden structure could survive. The entire design was built around one insight: if you made the glider land slowly enough, wood was strong enough. The fuselage construction used a technique borrowed from boat building. The frame consisted of wooden formers, curved ribs that defined the shape, connected by longerons, horizontal stringers running the length of the fuselage. Over this frame, they stretched fabric that was then treated with dope, a chemical coating that tightened and waterproofed the material. The floor was 3/4-inch plywood, strong enough to support a jeep or a light artillery piece. The nose was hinged. The entire front section could swing upward, creating an opening large enough to drive a rebird vehicle straight out. This solved the unloading problem that had plagued early glider designs. You didn't need special equipment or complex procedures. Land, open the nose, drive out. For cargo that couldn't drive, troops could simply carry it out through the massive opening. The simplicity was deliberate. These gliders would be operated by army pilots with minimal training, landing in fields that might be cratered, muddy, or under fire. Complex systems would fail. Simple systems might survive. The first Horsa prototype flew in September 1941. George Chatterton watched from the ground as the ungainly wooden box lifted into the air behind a tow plane, circled the field, released, and landed. The glider bounced hard, the landing gear absorbing the impact, and rolled to a stop. Chatterton's first thought, recorded in his later memoirs, was that it looked like a shed someone had accidentally attached wings to. His second thought was that it might actually work. Testing revealed problems immediately. The early Horsas had a dangerous tendency to pitch up during tow, climbing above the tow plane and creating a situation where both aircraft could crash. Pilots called this getting in high tow, and it could be fatal. Engineers added dive brakes, panels that could be extended to increase drag and prevent the glider from climbing uncontrollably. The landing gear, designed to be jettisoned after takeoff to reduce weight and drag, sometimes failed to release. When it did release, it occasionally bounced back and struck the glider. The solution was a spring-loaded mechanism that pushed the gear away forcefully after release. The control cables, which ran through the wooden structure to the tail surfaces, stretched under load. This made the glider increasingly difficult to control during long tows. The fix was to use steel cables with minimal stretch characteristics, but this added weight. Every problem revealed another problem. Solving structural issues added weight. Adding weight meant slower flight and harder landings. Harder landings meant stronger structure needed, which added more weight. The engineering spiral seemed endless. By January 1942, the Air Ministry was ready to cancel the program. Then Germany made a critical mistake. In February 1942, German forces launched the Channel Dash, moving the battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau from Brest through the English Channel to German ports. British radar detected the movement, but the response was chaotic. Multiple attacks by torpedo bombers and destroyers failed to stop the ships. The embarrassment was enormous. Churchill demanded explanations. One of the failures had been communications. Different services couldn't coordinate effectively. Fighter cover arrived late. Torpedo bombers attacked without support. The Navy blamed the RAF. The RAF blamed inadequate intelligence. In the aftermath, the services were ordered to improve joint operations. This created an opportunity. George Chatterton had been arguing for months that glider operations required dedicated RAF tow planes and pilots. The RAF had refused, viewing glider towing as a waste of resources. After the Channel Dash debacle, that resistance weakened. The services needed to demonstrate they could cooperate. Glider operations became a test case. By March 1942, the RAF had assigned 32 Whitley bombers to towing duties and begun training tow pilots. This solved the most critical bottleneck. You could build thousands of gliders, but they were useless without aircraft to tow them. Production expanded rapidly. Furniture factories across Britain retooled to build Horsas. The designs were deliberately simple to allow production by companies with no aircraft experience. Workers who'd been building tables and chairs found themselves assembling wings and fuselages. The construction techniques were familiar. Cut wooden components to specifications, assemble with glue and screws, stretch fabric, apply dope. By late 1942, Horsa production reached 10 per week. By mid-1943, it would peak at 40 per week. The Americans, watching British progress, developed their own combat glider, the Waco CG-4A, smaller than the Horsa, carrying only 13 troops or a single jeep, but built with the same philosophy. Plywood and fabric, simple construction, designed for mass production by non-aircraft companies. Waco, Ford, General Motors, Cessna, even a casket company built CG-4As. By 1944, American production would reach 600 gliders per month. But building the gliders was only half the challenge. The other half was finding men willing to fly them. The recruitment posters for the Glider Pilot Regiment appeared in British Army camps in mid-1942. They promised excitement, aviation experience, and elite status. What they didn't prominently mention was that glider pilots would be flying engineless aircraft into combat zones, landing in unprepared fields, often under fire, and in craft that couldn't go around for a second attempt. You got one approach, one landing, and then you were a soldier on the ground because gliders didn't fly home. The volunteers came anyway, thousands of them. Some were motivated by the promise of flight training without requiring years of education. Some wanted escape from infantry drudgery. Some genuinely believed in the strategic potential of airborne operations. The selection process was brutal. Candidates needed to be soldiers first, pilots second. They'd be landing behind enemy lines and fighting as infantry after their gliders were down. Physical fitness standards were strict. Mental aptitude tests filtered for men who could handle the stress of combat flying in aircraft with no engines and no second chances. The training program Chatterton developed at Shobdon and later at larger facilities pushed men to their limits. They started on small training, gliders, learning basic aerodynamics and control. Then progressed to hotspur trainers, experiencing towed flight for the first time. The sensation of being dragged through the air by another aircraft, connected only by a rope, took adjustment. Early flights saw high rates of air sickness, then came training in the Horsa itself. The first time most pilots sat in a Horsa cockpit, they were struck by how basic it was. 2 seats side by side, a control yoke, rudder pedals, a few instruments, airspeed indicator, altimeter, turn and slip indicator. No engine instruments because there was no engine. No radio in early models because radios were heavy and expensive. You flew by sight, by feel, by the tension in the tow rope. Landing practice consumed hundreds of hours. Pilots practiced approaches into fields of varying sizes. They learned to judge height without engine sound as reference. They practiced landing with partial control failure, with asymmetric loads, with battle damage. The training was dangerous. Gliders crashed regularly. Between 1942 and 1944, training accidents killed over 100 glider pilots. But the survivors emerged as some of the most skilled pilots in any air force. They could land a 30-foot wingspan aircraft in a 400-yard field, at night, with enemy fire raking the approach path. By early 1943, the glider pilot regiment numbered over 2,000 men. The Americans were training similar numbers, and the German intelligence services were watching all of this with growing confusion. Abwehr reports from Britain described massive glider production, thousands of troops training for airborne operations, entire divisions reorganized for glider assault. German analysts struggled to understand the strategic logic. Why commit such resources to a method of warfare that Crete had proven was suicide? The prevailing theory was that the Allies were preparing for desperation operations. When the invasion of Europe came, as it inevitably would, the British and Americans would throw airborne troops into suicidal diversionary attacks to support the main amphibious landings. The gliders would deliver the first wave, suffer catastrophic casualties, and tie down German reserves for a few hours before being wiped out. This fit German assumptions about Allied capabilities and strategy. The British and Americans had material superiority, but lacked German tactical skill. They'd use brute force, accept massive casualties, and overwhelm German positions through sheer weight of numbers. Airborne operations fit this pattern. Throw away entire divisions in the opening hours to create brief chaos behind German lines. Based on this analysis, German coastal defences incorporated anti-glider measures, Rommel's asparagus, tall wooden poles planted in fields where gliders might land, designed to impale any glider attempting to touch down. Minefields in likely landing zones, quick reaction forces positioned to counterattack airborne landings before they could consolidate. But the defences were designed to counter small-scale raids or diversionary attacks, not strategic airborne assaults. The Germans simply couldn't imagine the Allies committing tens of thousands of elite troops to airborne operations. The numbers didn't make sense unless you were willing to accept total loss of the assault force. What German intelligence didn't understand was that the Allies had solved the problem that made Crete a disaster. They'd figured out how to deliver heavy weapons by glider, rapidly enough to give airborne troops fighting power before counterattacks could destroy them. The key was the cargo capacity of the Horsa and the CG-4A. A Horsa could carry a quarter-ton jeep with 4 men and a trailer loaded with ammunition, or a 6-pounder anti-tank gun with its towing jeep and crew, or 17 fully equipped paratroopers with heavy weapons. The CG-4A carried less but was more maneuverable and easier to produce in quantity. Put hundreds of these gliders down in a concentrated area within minutes of each other, and you didn't have scattered groups of light infantry. You had a mechanized force with anti-tank capability, mobile firepower, and logistics support. The other critical innovation was the glider pilots themselves. Unlike conventional aircrew who returned to base after delivery, glider pilots were trained infantry. After landing, they fought. A typical glider assault would put 60 soldiers on the ground, 30 passengers plus 2 pilots. Those 2 pilots added nearly 7% to the combat strength of every landing. Multiply that across hundreds of gliders, and the effect was significant. By June 1944, the pieces were in place. Britain had produced over 3,000 Horsas. America had built over 12,000 CG-4As. The combined British and American glider pilot force numbered over 15,000 men, and German intelligence still believed glider operations were a sideshow. The dawn of June 6, 1944 would begin their education. The first Allied gliders to land in Nazi-occupied Europe on D-Day didn't touch down on the beaches of Normandy. They arrived in darkness, 6 hours before the amphibious landings, carrying men tasked with what many considered a suicide mission. At 23 minutes past midnight, on June 6, 1944, 6 Horsa gliders released from their Halifax tow planes at 5,000 feet over the Caen Canal in Normandy. Major John Howard of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry sat in the lead glider, his stomach knotted with tension that had nothing to do with the violent manoeuvres of the descent. His objective was a bridge, not just any bridge, but a specific bridge over the Caen Canal that German armour would use to counterattack the British beach landings at dawn. If that bridge remained in German hands, panzer divisions could race to the coast and drive the invasion back into the sea. If Howard's company could capture and hold it, British forces would have hours to establish their beachhead before German armour arrived. The plan was insane. Land 6 gliders within 50 yards of a defended bridge, in darkness, and storm German positions before they could react or demolish the bridge. Everything depended on precision. The landing zones were tiny, bordered by the canal on one side and flooded fields on the other. Miss by 100 yards, and you'd land in water or marsh. The gliders would sink, the troops would drown, and the mission would fail before it began. Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork piloted the lead glider. He'd trained for this moment for 18 months, practicing night approaches into narrow fields until he could judge distance by starlight and instinct. Now, descending through darkness at 80 miles per hour, he had one chance to put his glider exactly where it needed to be. The Horsa dropped through 3,000 feet. Walwork could see nothing below. Clouds obscured the moon. No lights marked the landing zone because the Germans held it. He was navigating by dead reckoning, by elapsed time since release, by the feel of the controls. At 1,000 feet, the clouds broke. Walwork saw the canal, a dark line cutting through darker landscape. He saw the bridge, exactly where intelligence photos had promised it would be. He pulled the glider into a steep banking turn, bleeding off altitude, lining up on the tiny field beside the bridge. The Horsa's dive brakes deployed with a rattling bang. The glider's descent steepened. 80 miles per hour, 70, 60. Trees rushed up at them. Walwork hauled back on the yoke. The glider's nose lifted, the descent flattened, and the wheels hit earth with tremendous force. The landing gear collapsed immediately, as designed. The Horsa's belly hit the ground, and the wooden structure began to fail in exactly the sequence engineers had calculated. The friction of wood scraping across dirt slowed the glider. Not enough. They were still moving at 40 miles per hour when the nose hit a line of barbed wire the Germans had strung along the field's edge. The wire wrapped around the nose, caught, and jerked the entire glider to a violent stop. The deceleration threw every man forward against their restraints. Howard felt like he'd been punched in the chest by a giant fist. The glider's tail lifted off the ground from the momentum, hung in the air for a moment, then slammed back down. Total silence. Then German voices, shouting questions from the bridge. Walwork had put them down 47 yards from their objective, in darkness, in a glider, on the first attempt. It was the most precise combat landing in aviation history, and the men inside had about 10 seconds to process it before they had to fight for their lives. The glider's door flew open. Lieutenant Den Brotheridge, leading the 1st platoon, jumped out and immediately fell flat. He'd expected to land in France. Instead, he'd landed in a crater created by earlier Allied bombing. The irony would have been funny if German machine guns weren't already opening fire. Brotheridge pulled himself out of the crater and charged toward the bridge, firing his Sten gun from the hip. Behind him, his platoon poured out of the glider and followed, screaming like madmen to terrify the defenders and mask their own fear. The other 5 gliders landed within seconds of each other. 2 touched down within 100 yards of the bridge. 1 landed 400 yards away after the tow rope snapped early. 2 more came down near a second bridge over the Orne River, part of the same operation. German defenders at the Caen Canal Bridge, woken from sleep by the crash of landing gliders, stumbled out of their bunkers trying to understand what was happening. They'd been told to expect paratroopers, small scattered groups they could hunt down in the darkness. Instead, they faced organized infantry assaulting from 50 yards away with grenades, automatic weapons, and suicidal courage. The fight lasted 15 minutes. Brotheridge reached the bridge first and was shot in the neck by a German sentry. He'd become the first Allied soldier killed by enemy fire on D-Day, dying on the bridge he'd captured. His men overwhelmed the German position, killed or captured the defenders, and most critically, prevented the Germans from triggering demolition charges that would have destroyed the bridge. By 12:45, 22 minutes after the first glider landed, Major Howard radioed the code word confirming success: ham and jam. The bridges were captured intact. At 01:30, British paratroopers from the 6th Airborne Division began dropping around the bridges to reinforce Howard's company. At 0300, German counterattacks began. Howard's men, now reinforced but still outnumbered, held the bridges through the night against increasingly desperate German attempts to recapture them. At 1300 hours, 13 hours after Howard's gliders landed, advance units from Sword Beach reached the bridges. The connection between airborne and amphibious forces was established. The German counterattack route was closed. Panzer divisions that should have reached the beaches in the first hours instead spent the day fighting their way through British airborne positions miles inland. The Pegasus Bridge operation, as it became known, validated everything George Chatterton had promised about glider warfare. Precision delivery of combat troops with their weapons directly onto the objective. Immediate combat effectiveness without the delays and disorganization of parachute drops. The ability to carry heavy equipment that paratroopers couldn't jump with. But Pegasus Bridge was a small operation. 6 gliders, 180 men. The real test would come 3 months later, when the Allies attempted to land an entire army by glider in broad daylight, deep behind German lines. Operation Market Garden, conceived in September 1944, was the most ambitious airborne operation ever planned. The concept was breathtaking in its audacity. Land 3 airborne divisions, British, American, and Polish, along a 64-mile corridor through occupied Netherlands. Each division would capture bridges over rivers and canals. British ground forces, spearheaded by the 30th Corps, would race up the corridor, crossing each bridge in sequence, and drive into Germany before winter. If it succeeded, the war might end by Christmas. If it failed, tens of thousands of elite troops would be trapped behind enemy lines with no escape route. The operation required more than 1,600 transport aircraft and over 2,300 gliders. The first Allied Airborne Army, created in August 1944 specifically for large-scale airborne operations, would commit 3 divisions simultaneously. The US, 101st Airborne would drop around Eindhoven to capture bridges over the Wilhelmina Canal and the Dommel River, the US. 82nd Airborne would take Nijmegen and its bridge over the Waal River. The British 1st Airborne Division, reinforced by the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, would land at Arnhem and capture the bridge over the Rhine. Arnhem was the prize. The Rhine was the last major river barrier protecting Germany's industrial heartland. If British forces could cross at Arnhem, they'd have an open path to the Ruhr. But Arnhem was also the most distant objective, 64 miles behind German lines. The British 1st Airborne would be on its own for days before ground forces could reach them. Everything depended on the ground offensive moving fast enough, and on the gliders landing enough combat power to hold against German counterattacks. The first lift took off from British airfields on the morning of September 17th. Over 400 gliders, mostly Horsas with some American CG-4, AS, carrying troops, jeeps, anti-tank guns, ammunition, medical supplies, and even light tanks. The air armada stretched across the sky for miles. German civilians watching from below initially thought it was another bombing raid. Then they saw the gliders and realized something far worse was happening. Hauptmann Klaus Becker watched them come. His 9th SS Panzer Division had been refitting near Arnhem after being mauled in Normandy. The division was under strength, with many tanks in repair and troops recovering from wounds. But it was still a Panzer Division, with experienced crews and heavy armour, and it was sitting directly in the path of the British landing zones. Becker's first reaction, watching hundreds of gliders descend, was disbelief. The British were landing an army in broad daylight within sight of German armour. It seemed like suicide. His second reaction was to sound the alarm and prepare for combat. The Germans would make the British pay dearly for their boldness. The gliders came down in waves. The landing zones north and west of Arnhem were open heathland and farm fields, good terrain for glider operations. But they were also 8 miles from the bridge, the primary objective. This distance was a compromise. Closer landing zones would have put gliders under direct fire from German flak positions around the bridge. The 8-mile gap gave the Germans critical time to react. As the first gliders landed and troops began unloading, German forces throughout the region mobilized. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, was having lunch at his headquarters in Oosterbeek when he heard the gliders approaching. He walked outside, saw the sky filled with aircraft, and immediately understood the Allied objective. They're going for the bridge. Get every available unit to Arnhem now. What happened over the next 9 days would become one of the most controversial operations of the war. The British 1st Airborne Division landed, over 13,000 troops by parachute and glider. They brought 6-pounder and 17-pounder anti-tank guns, jeeps, motorcycles, ammunition for days of fighting. The gliders delivered this equipment exactly as planned. Horsa after Horsa touched down, noses opened, and vehicles rolled out. Within hours, British forces had more combat power on the ground than any previous airborne operation had achieved. But the distance from landing zones to the bridge proved fatal. German forces blocked the roads. Only one battalion, the 2nd Parachute Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, reached the bridge's north end. Frost's 600 men dug in and held against overwhelming German attacks, waiting for reinforcement that never came. The rest of the division spent 3 days fighting through German positions, trying to reach Frost. The gliders kept coming. 2nd and 3rd lifts brought more troops and supplies, but German flak had intensified. Gliders approaching Arnhem on September 18th and 19th flew through murderous anti-aircraft fire. Many were hit before releasing from tow. Others took damage during descent. Some crashed, killing everyone aboard. Others landed in German-held areas and were immediately overrun. The wooden construction that made gliders cheap and easy to build offered no protection against exploding shells. 20mm flak rounds punched through plywood and fabric like paper. Larger shells could disintegrate a glider in mid-air. Pilots had no ability to evade. Once released from tow, a glider followed a ballistic path to the ground. You couldn't dodge, couldn't climb, couldn't do anything but fly straight into whatever the Germans threw at you and hope you survived long enough to land. Sergeant Roy Hatch, piloting a Horsa on the 2nd lift, watched the glider ahead of him explode in a fireball. One moment it was there, the next it was debris falling toward Earth. He kept flying because there was no alternative. His glider took 3 hits during descent. 2 rounds punched through the wings. The 3rd shattered the nose canopy. Glass fragments cut his face. He could barely see through the blood. He landed hard, the glider ground-looping across a ploughed field. When his passengers climbed out, they found Hatch still in his seat, bleeding, checking his instruments by habit, even though the flight was over. They pulled him out and he fought with them for 3 days before capture. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By September 20th, the situation at Arnhem had deteriorated catastrophically. Frost's battalion at the bridge, out of ammunition and overwhelmed by German armour, surrendered. The rest of the division was trapped in a shrinking perimeter around Oosterbeek, surrounded by German forces. The 30th Corps ground offensive, delayed by German resistance at Nijmegen, couldn't break through. On September 25th, the survivors of the 1st Airborne Division retreated across the Rhine under cover of darkness. Of the 13,000 men who'd landed, fewer than 3,000 escaped. The rest were killed or captured. The gliders had performed exactly as designed. They delivered thousands of troops and tons of equipment precisely where planned. The wooden construction that Germans had mocked had proven remarkably resilient. Gliders that crashed hard enough to be written off as total losses still protected their occupants well enough that many walked away. The honeycomb wooden structure absorbed impact energy through controlled failure, exactly as the engineers had calculated. But no amount of engineering could overcome the operational failures. The landing zones were too far from objectives. The intelligence that claimed only weak German forces held Arnhem was catastrophically wrong. The ground offensive moved too slowly. Market Garden failed not because the gliders failed, but because the plan was flawed. Yet even in failure, the operation demonstrated something profound. The Allies could land an army behind enemy lines in a single day. They could do it in broad daylight. They could deliver not just infantry, but mechanized forces with heavy weapons. The losses were terrible, but the capability was proven, and that capability would shape the final months of the war. The Rhine crossing at Wesel in March 1945 showed what airborne forces could achieve when properly employed. Operation Varsity landed the British 6th Airborne Division and the US 17th Airborne Division east of the Rhine to support Montgomery's assault across the river. Unlike Market Garden, these troops landed close to their objectives, just a few thousand yards beyond the riverbank. Unlike Market Garden, they landed in conjunction with ground forces already across the Rhine, not days ahead of them. Unlike Market Garden, the landing zones were saturated with Allied airstrikes and artillery fire before the gliders arrived. Over 1,300 gliders participated in Varsity, the largest single-day glider operation of the war. They delivered jeeps, anti-tank guns, bulldozers, medical teams, even bridge-building equipment. The losses were still significant. German flak shot down dozens of gliders and tow planes. But by nightfall on March 24th, over 21,000 Allied troops were fighting east of the Rhine. German counterattacks, which might have destroyed parachute forces landing piecemeal, shattered against organized resistance from troops who'd landed with their heavy weapons. Within 48 hours, Allied ground forces had broken out of the Rhine bridgehead. The German defensive line had collapsed. The path into Germany lay open. Varsity vindicated the glider concept completely. You could land an army by air, you could give them the combat power to win, and you could do it fast enough to exploit. The chaos before defenders recovered. The wooden gliders the Germans had mocked in 1941 had helped end the war. The final accounting of the glider war makes for stark reading. Britain produced 3,800 Horsas and 2,100 smaller Hamilcar gliders capable of carrying light tanks. America built over 14,000 CG-4 AS and over 900 larger CG-13 AS and CG-15 AS. The combined Allied glider fleet exceeded 26,000 aircraft. These gliders flew more than 700 combat missions, landing over 88,000 troops and thousands of tons of equipment. The casualty rates were brutal. Glider pilots, who fought as infantry after landing, suffered disproportionately. In some operations, pilot casualties exceeded 50%. The wooden construction that made mass production possible offered minimal protection, but the strategic impact was undeniable. Every major Allied airborne operation from D-Day forward depended on gliders to deliver the combat power that made the difference between success and annihilation. The Germans never built an equivalent capability. After Crete, Hitler's ban on large-scale airborne operations meant Germany's glider program languished. The DFS-230 remained in production but saw limited use. German industry, stretched thin by strategic bombing and material shortages, couldn't afford to build thousands of single-use wooden aircraft. By 1944, Germany faced airborne assaults it couldn't counter because it had dismissed the concept years earlier. The technical judgment had been correct. Wooden gliders were fragile, vulnerable, and suffered high loss rates. The strategic judgment had been catastrophically wrong. Accepting those losses to land mechanized forces deep behind enemy lines changed the nature of warfare. George Chatterton, who'd built the glider pilot regiment from 12 training gliders and a handful of volunteers, lived to see his concept proven in the hardest possible testing ground. He survived the war, retired as a colonel, and spent his later years writing and speaking about airborne operations. In his memoir, The Wings of Pegasus, published in 1962, he reflected on the contrast between the skepticism of 1941 and the reality of 1944. "We were told gliders were a poor man's air force," he wrote. Perhaps they were, but poor men, properly equipped and led, can defeat rich men who underestimate them. The German underestimation of Allied glider capabilities stemmed from reasonable technical analysis applied to the wrong strategic framework. They assessed gliders as aircraft and found them wanting. The Allies used gliders as flying trucks and found them revolutionary. The difference in perspective determined the difference in outcome. After the war, the glider disappeared from military inventories almost as fast as it had appeared. Helicopters offered everything gliders provided: vertical landing capability, without requiring tow planes or suicide missions. By the Korean War, helicopters were airlifting troops and supplies, while gliders rotted in storage depots. The last combat glider operation occurred in March 1953, when French forces used gliders to insert troops into Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam. The irony of using gliders to reinforce a doomed garrison wasn't lost on veterans of Arnhem. Today, only a handful of Horsas and CG-4 as survive in museums. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans displays a CG-4A, its plywood construction and fabric covering visible behind protective barriers. The Museum of Army Flying in Middle Wallop, England, has a restored Horsa, its massive wingspan dominating the hangar. These artifacts sit silent, their combat history reduced to plaques and photographs, but they represent something profound about warfare and innovation. Sometimes the technically inferior solution is strategically superior. Sometimes accepting losses is the path to victory. Sometimes desperate improvisation defeats careful planning. The Germans built the best tanks, the best machine guns, the best tactical doctrine. They lost to enemies who built mountains of adequate equipment and used it with operational flexibility German rigidity couldn't match. The glider program epitomized this approach. Build cheap wooden aircraft by the thousands, train pilots in months rather than years, accept catastrophic loss rates, land armies anyway. The mathematics of industrial warfare favored those willing to trade material for strategic advantage. Germany couldn't afford that trade. They had limited resources and couldn't waste them on single-use aircraft. Britain and America, with their vast industrial capacity, could afford to build aircraft designed to be destroyed. That difference, replicated across every weapon system and strategy, determined the war's outcome. Sergeant Roy Hatch, the glider pilot who landed bleeding and half-blind at Arnhem, spent the rest of the war in a German POW camp. He was liberated in April 1945 and returned to Britain weighing 40 pounds less than when he'd been captured. In a letter to George Chatterton written in 1946, Hatch reflected on his experience. "We knew the gliders were plywood and prayers," he wrote. "We knew every landing was controlled crash. We knew the Germans would shoot us out of the sky given half a chance. We flew anyway because someone had to. I don't know if we were brave or just young enough to think we'd survive. Probably both. The gliders gave us a chance to strike where the enemy didn't expect us. That was worth the risk." Chatterton kept that letter for the rest of his life. The final irony of the glider war belongs to Klaus Becker, the German officer who'd laughed at wooden gliders on September 17, 1944. He survived Arnhem, survived the war, and in the 1970s gave an interview to a British military historian researching market garden. Asked about his first impression of the Allied gliders, Becker was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "We thought they were foolish. Landing armies in wooden boxes. It seemed like desperation. We were wrong. It was innovation. We mistook creativity for weakness, and we paid for that mistake. The gliders were crude, yes, but they worked." That's all that mattered in war. Working solutions defeat elegant failures. The German military's elegant failures, their sophisticated analysis that dismissed glider warfare as impractical, cost them the strategic initiative in the air. While German planners debated the technical limitations of wooden aircraft, British and American factories built them by the thousands. While German doctrine, forged in the blood of Crete, ruled out large-scale airborne operations, Allied doctrine embraced them. While German defenders prepared for threats they understood, Allied gliders delivered threats they'd dismissed as impossible. In the calculus of total war, Being right about technical details matters less than being right about strategic possibilities. The Germans were right that wooden gliders were fragile. The Allies were right that fragile gliders landing in sufficient numbers could change the course of battles. One truth was engineering, the other was victory. The 13,000 troops that landed at Arnhem represented the culmination of 3 years of development, training, and doctrinal innovation. They flew in aircraft the German military had concluded were obsolete before the war even began. Many of those troops died or were captured in the operation's failure. But their presence, the mere fact that an Allied army could appear 60 miles behind German lines in a single afternoon, demonstrated a capability Germany couldn't counter and couldn't replicate. That asymmetry, repeated across every theatre and every weapons system, ground the Wehrmacht down. Superior German tactical skill couldn't overcome Allied material superiority and operational flexibility. The best tank cannot defeat 10 adequate tanks. The best defensive position cannot hold against attackers who land behind you. The most sophisticated military doctrine cannot overcome an enemy willing to try what you've deemed impossible and make it work through sheer industrial power and human courage. The glider pilots who flew those wooden boxes into combat, knowing they might die in the landing or the fighting afterward, embodied that courage. They were clerks and farmers and factory workers given a few months of training and told to fly aircraft that had no business being in combat. They did it anyway. They landed armies. They changed warfare. And then, when helicopters made their aircraft obsolete, they went home and became civilians again, their contribution largely forgotten. The museums preserve the gliders. The histories record the operations. But the essential story, the story of how wooden aircraft mocked by enemies became instruments of strategic victory. That story sits in archives and fading memories. It deserves better. It deserves recognition that sometimes the desperate improvisation wins, that sometimes the technically imperfect solution is strategically perfect, that sometimes courage and creativity matter more than sophisticated engineering. The Germans laughed at America's wooden gliders. Then 13,000 airborne troops landed behind their lines, and the laughter died in their throats. That's the lesson. Underestimate desperate innovation at your peril. Mock your enemy's inadequate solutions at your peril. Assume your technical superiority guarantees victory at your peril. The side that adapts, that builds what works rather than what's elegant, that accepts losses to gain advantages, that side wins. The gliders, crude and fragile and expendable, proved that truth in the hardest classroom imaginable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.